Hi everyone, I'm Patrick Foley. I'm the coordinator of the Brazil Solidarity Initiative, and I'm here with Julia Felmanas, who's the coordinator of the Nucleus Londres, who's just returned back from a trip to Brazil. And we're delighted to be talking today about Lula's first 100 days in government. So thanks for joining me, Julia.
Hi, Patrick. Hi, everyone.
So Julia, so tell us about your trip, about your return. I know you were there for the inauguration. It'd be great
Yeah.
to hear about some of the stories of that and the energy in the air when Lula was inaugurated.
Yeah. Yeah, it was really amazing. I went the end of December, and already there was a lot of activity going on because Lula set up a transition team, so there was lots of talk about, looking at the government and everything. But I actually went to Brasilia on the inauguration day, on that day. So we drove all across Brazil, past all the soya, first the sugar cane and then the coffee and then the soya plantations. Saw all the Bolsonaro people with their flags on the side of the big farms and got to Brasilia, but Brasilia was a totally different atmosphere. It was absolutely all red, let's say. There was a huge party atmosphere, and it was really nice. But on the actual day of the inauguration, they had obviously they had to think about security. And for those people who don't know Brasilia, Brasilia is built on the shape of an airplane. So you have the main axis of the plane, which is where all the ministries are, finishing off on the cockpit, which was where you have the so-called three-power square. So you have the the president's palace, you have the Supreme Court, and you have the legislative, the Congress, and the Senate in the middle there. So you had two levels of security. First, to go into the role of ministries, which is where you had like a massive party prepared with loads of musicians and events and all sorts of things going on. And then for the actual day, you had in the three-power square in the cockpit of the plane, you had the second security to actually watch Lula um, being inaugurated, basically, and they had big screens and stuff. But they told us that we shouldn't take anything with us because of the security, and not even water. They told us they'd have water in the square, and I had no idea what I was doing. I just knew I had to be there, and I was going to go really early, so I left at before 10 o'clock to be there. Was there by 11 o'clock in the square, which is totally open in the heat of Brazil, no trees, nothing at all. And I didn't take anything with me because I thought that I was going to get the so-called Lula kit that they were selling, which were things like t-shirts and hats and stuff like that. And I just thought, I'm not going to get myself anything because I'm going to buy these things over there. We got to the square and there was absolutely nothing, nothing at all, except for a few water tents, let's say. But there weren't enough water tents for everyone. And that the whole security was actually set up not by Lula himself or his people, but by the governor of the federal district, which was the guy that was eventually suspended during the troubles of the 8th of January. And so
Mm.
it was everybody was complaining because there was nothing there. The sun was so hot and there was nothing in the massive queues. I spent 2 hours in the queue to just get myself a couple of glasses of water, basically. And and everybody was pretty much in that same situation, especially the older people and stuff. And people were so hot that they eventually had to get the firemen to start hosing people down in on the sides of the square. And
Wow.
I was on this queue, sort of waiting for water and not thinking, what do I do now? Do I stay in the queue for my glass of water, or do I go under to hose myself down? And eventually I I was so hot that I came out totally burnt of that thing. Basically, I was really, really burnt, and I didn't even stay to the end of Lula's speech because
Wow.
yes, Lula came out at past 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So,
It's
but
interesting to hear. It's interesting to hear the sort of stark contrast of that level of security for the
yeah.
inauguration itself, when we know what was coming around the corner, which we'll touch on in a minute. But you mentioned you heard a bit of Lula. Can you tell me a bit about, other than the problems of it? Can you tell me a bit about the feel and the atmosphere of all the PT supporters who were there?
It was
Um,
amazing. It was a huge sea of red, and you had people from absolutely everywhere in Brazil. Really, there were people all the way from the south, people from the Amazon region, people from the northeast, people from Brasilia itself. It was an amazing situation in the square. I just stayed with the people and mingled there, and then and then eventually we had there were a couple of big screens so you could see what was happening, because Lula first went into the Congress to give his speeches, and then he sort of made his way to the palace and went up that ramp, and I think people have seen the pictures of Lula and the people chosen to be with him, plus the dog. Think it was really nice. It was a special occasion, really, to be there with all these people when we felt, the sort of relief of so many years of tension. It was also tense because, there'd been problems with security, there'd been people camping, so everybody was a little bit sort of, we don't know if anything's going to happen. We don't know if Lula's going to be safe.
Well, I mean, yeah, of course,
Uh,
because the we saw in the campaign a lot of attacks on Lula supporters. People throwing
yeah.
things and attacking supporters. So I can completely understand the tension there. And of course, you were also there. I know you weren't there on the day, but you were there for sort of the turn of the tide as the Bolsonaristas started to arrive. So can you tell me a bit about that shift in mood, and then we can talk a bit more about what actually happened on January the 8th.
Yeah, like I said, that we had this amazing atmosphere in Brasilia, and we know Brasilia is quite a conservative place, but that day it was amazing. And then we left. I was there with my daughter. My daughter's university doing politics, so we'd already decided that we were going to go and then go for a trip in a national park and then come back to Brasilia around the 7th or 8th of January, so that we could actually go and visit the palaces and everything that obviously we couldn't do during inauguration. So that's what we did. We sort of drove north up to the national park, thinking that we were going to have like a quiet, calm time holiday. But I think everybody who was in Brasilia had the same idea. So you went out to this beautiful place full of lovely waterfalls and and pools of water. And all you had is a load of PT supporters all singing Lula, Lula in the middle of the waterfall in nature. So that was quite funny as well. But when we came back to Brasilia on the 7th, on the 6th, on the night of the 6th, the atmosphere was totally different. We decided to go back to the same hotel that we were, and that same hotel that sort of had this great party feeling and whatever, suddenly you had everybody dressed in yellow and in yellow t-shirts, and a lot of sort of middle-aged women, what we call in Portuguese, tias do zap. So what's up panties sort of thing, but perhaps a little bit more sinister, groups of men, big men, sort of that you could see if you looked at them that they were probably ex-army people or ex-policemen, or maybe still active. I don't know really, but it still didn't click. I could see all these people around me, and I was but I didn't really think much, you know. So, oh, well, you know, there they are, these people, you know, we're confronting them here. They're sitting here in the hotel with us, but nothing more. And then on the 8th, still on the 7th, we went up to the square to try and go. We had no idea what was going on, and the police was there blocking everything, and we couldn't go in. But we could see already people trying to set up over there, you know, some of the groups in their tents and things outside the main axis of Brasilia, and not being able to go into the square at the time. And then on the 8th, when we left, and I thought it was quite funny because you had these big men in their fatigues, and they were sort of calling Ubers to go up to the main square, and still nothing, you know. I just, oh well, you know, these were weirdos. I don't know what I thought. All I know is that when we left, we were driving all day. And then when we got sort of to our destination on that day, and I opened my telephone, that I sort of realized, well, what had happened, or what was still happening on that day, which was the storming of the Three Power Square, the same way. I don't know if it's related to the US or not, but it's certainly the same type of people thinking in the same sort of way. From then on, the atmosphere totally changed, really.
And the banners they were carrying, you know, calling for the military to carry out a coup, and it's quite striking to hear the difference in the security when it's an inauguration and it's a, you know, an excitable mood, and then yet this mob was able to march up to these great places of power, these sort of historic and buildings, and lay waste to so much. And you know, what can you tell us about that difference in security? And I know that Lula's had quite a strong response, but could you touch on a bit more of that, about how the security responded to this far right, and the sort of subsequently what the government has done?
I mean, we could see that, you know, already as soon as Lula's election was over, that people were still these people in yellow, Bolsonaro supporters, were still hanging around outside army barracks and everything. And Lula was still not in government, so he didn't really have any power. But they were trying to get people to get out of these places, and sort of, especially in Brasilia, and security was go, oh no, it's okay, it's no problem. And the governor of Brasilia decided to have as his security minister the former justice minister from Bolsonaro. And so I think around, I can't remember if it was around the 6th now, but certainly after Lula came into power, there was a change in the security secretary for the federal district. And this guy apparently went on holiday. He went to the USA. So the security was left for the second in command. So basically they knew what they were doing. And then they found a letter, it was a sort of a document, but a draft document about how they were going to take over and try to bring Lula down. And just this week, actually, they found a document again with this guy who was Minister of Justice for Bolsonaro, and then Security Secretary for the federal district. He had they found a document that sort of showed clearly that he had got in touch with the federal police, the highway federal police, during the elections, to stop voters in the state of Bahia from voting Lula. So we knew that was going on during the day. We had news of that going on, but now we found this link with this very same person who was apparently in charge of the security of Brasilia for those days.
That's quite
But
shocking.
there was a very, very quick reaction from our Minister of Justice, who, you know, suspended the governor in Brasilia, brought somebody in, changed the head of the army, and said, but that was Lula who changed the head of the army and stuff. So there were very quick moves to try and change the whole scenery in terms of security. But that sort of changed the mood totally, because for that whole week we were sort of seeing the inauguration of the various ministers, thinking about the fact that we had things like a ministry for race equality, a ministry for indigenous affairs with the first indigenous woman minister, the actual build up of the Minister of Justice itself, with a number of Black people dealing with things like security, race, human rights, etc. It all sounded great, you know. Everybody was very euphoric about the coming of this new government, until that took over and that happened, and it sort of brought us back into, wow, you know.
This is what we're up
So it
against.
hasn't disappeared because Lula's been elected doesn't mean that Brazil suddenly changed. Yeah.
And I mean, just some of the stories from the day was, you know, that just to echo what you're saying, is I heard that a lot of the marches were actually camped outside of the army headquarters. So they marched from the army headquarters to the presidential palace, to the Congress, and stories of military police telling their colleagues, don't arrest this man, no, this one's a friend, he's okay, he's a friend, this person who's smashing up the Congress, not this one and not this person.
Yeah.
The
police opened the way for them to go in, so they actually allowed people to go in, you know, into Congress, and these so-called people pro law and order started destroying everything, you know.
Absolutely shocking. And just on that a bit further, you know, I know that Bolsonaro himself sort of cautiously condemned the attack from afar. He obviously wasn't there for the inauguration. He immediately flew to the US for that. But there is obviously other evidence that shows that he was involved in it, or he at least knew about it. And what does that attack say to you about the sort of challenges ahead? I know you said it meant that Bolsonaro is not going away. But what do you think? Do you think this has changed the approach that Lula's government is going to take, or the approach that the base is going to take, or do you think that because of the nature of the vote, people knew that this was going to be a real fight?
I think people knew that this was going to be a real fight. I think it's not something just in Brazil. Obviously, Brazil has been the most let's say it's dramatic example of what's going on at the moment. But somehow we've throughout the world unleashed the extreme right. The far right is something that's everywhere, you know, and certain ideas which maybe 10, 20 years ago would have been unthinkable, people are now able to voice in terms of their ideas. And also Bolsonaro is very much, he's got a couple of bases to his movement. One is the religious right, and the other is the military, police, militia base that he has, and the agribusiness as well. So
is this what I've heard called the bullets, Bible, and beef lobby?
Yeah, you could call it that, yes. And he's also, I mean, despite the fact, I don't know, people need to understand a little bit about how Brazilian politics works. But despite the fact that Lula won the election, the largest party in government at the moment is Bolsonaro's party. The PT has come second. But if you put all the left together, I don't think you get more than maybe 1/5 to maximum a quarter of deputies in the House. So we need to make alliances. But the fact is, you have a hell of a lot of right-wing people in Congress itself. as well as a grassroots base for Bolsonaro there. It is true that Bolsonaro going away to the US before the election sort of meant that the extreme right vote is split at the moment. So Bolsonaro has a base. Other people have a base, and some people don't have a base at all. I mean, we have elected in the Senate at the moment Moro, who the former judge who put Lula in jail. We also have a senator, Bolsonaro's vice president, Moro, a former military man. And Damares, who used to be Minister for Women during Bolsonaro, who's very, very culturally right-wing woman, anti-abortion, etc. She's also a senator in the House as well. So there is a political base, there is a grassroots base, and the forces that led to Dilma, to the coup against Dilma, haven't gone away. They're still there. I mean, the whole reason to get rid of Dilma at the beginning was bringing in neoliberal policies and the idea of an economic right wing, and that's still there. So they propped up Bolsonaro for quite a while, were unhappy with him when he was, you know, being too open about who he was as such. But now they're starting again to show their, you know, put their heads out of the water already against Lula. So we have all these forces there. You know, it's not going to be easy.
Yeah, so I mean, I can see the avenues of that they'd also stop some of the policies coming through as well if they can block things in Congress and make it a lot more difficult. But despite those challenges, and you can talk about them a bit more if you think if you'd like on each sector, I'd say. What sort of gains has Lula managed to achieve in these first 100 days? Well, I saw some things about early presidential decrees, but it would also be good to hear, you know, despite these challenges, what policies the government is pushing ahead with.
Well, the government has been trying their best, first of all, to recover what Bolsonaro and Temer before him destroyed. I think just before the transition, because I don't know if you remember, and I don't know how many people here will know, we had something, we had a law that meant that Brazil couldn't spend any money at all every year after inflation. So during the transition, Lula managed to do a lot of work with Congress to be able to pass a law to bring in a greater limit, so that we would be able to spend money on the famous Bolsa Familia and a number of other social areas. So that was sort of negotiated in government and then had to be passed in Congress later on. So the new Bolsa Familia has just been launched. It's it's kept the level that Bolsonaro artificially put up of 600 reais, which is about £100, 600 reais per month, but it's Brazil we're talking about. And on top of that, 150 reais per child. So this is one of the things that Lula did. But he's also brought in some of the other policies that he had, like the housing policy. He brought back the medical policy, where they were bringing in doctors from mainly Cuba to work in areas where no Brazilian doctors used to go, and to overcome the lack of doctors that Brazil has for the population. So these policies have been brought back, as have policies to try to get rid of hunger, because Brazil went back into the map of hunger again. So they've got policies to support family farmers and to buy food for family farmers and distribute these to school. So a lot of the social programs are coming back, but unfortunately, there's not a lot of money there, because in this Congress, we're dealing, first of all, with the money that was set up by last Congress. So Lula has to make do with very little in terms of that. But he's also done other things as well. As we've already mentioned, he created a Ministry of Indigenous People headed by an Indigenous woman. We've seen that as soon as we got there, there was this huge crisis with the Yanomami people who were all dying of basically hunger because of miners going to their lands, polluting their land, and changing the way that they were doing. So this was a crisis that the Lula government had to deal with straight away. He's also brought in things like, he brought back the participatory councils. During Lula governments, we had something like 700 different types of councils where social movements and specialist groups or just the local populations could come together and participate in policy making. So that's all being brought back. But there's a hell of a lot to do. And unfortunately for us, and this is one of the greatest challenges, one of the things that Bolsonaro did do is made the central bank independent. So not only is the central bank independent, but they've kept in the president of the central bank is somebody who's a right-wing Bolsonaro supporter, who's doing their best to undermine any actions that the Lula government has. And the way that they do that is by bringing up interest rates, which is at, I think, 13% at the moment. I could be wrong. I'm not very great at numbers. But something like that, 13, 14% interest rates, which is really, really high, considering that Brazil doesn't have that high inflation and does have a reasonable amount of dollars, and it doesn't need that sort of that sort of interest rates, but he's keeping it high. And the whole council of the central bank, the monetary council, is set up by people put in by Bolsonaro.
Two huge challenges there. I mean, you mentioned the fiscal spending rules as well. Would you know when the Congress will be voting on a new budget, and when this, in the likelihood that Lula will be able to push for more public spending?
Well, a new budget will probably just come in at the end of the year for 24. But what we did have is something called the fiscal framework, which is something the so-called market insisted on if we were going to get rid of the ceiling, this cap on spending that we had before. So our Minister of Finance, Haddad, just came out with this so-called fiscal framework, which is some sort of regulation that keeps spending within certain limits. It's a band as opposed to being a line, which makes it a lot more flexible. It's not part of the constitution like the ceiling was, so it can be changed. And it has a lower level, which is anti-cyclical, in that however low the economy goes, there's still the need to spend some money, though that is very low. Well, I can't say. It'd be much better if we didn't have any sort of rules at all, to be honest. But then we have to think about two things. First, having some sort of being able to get the Congress to pass something which is very hard with the
Mm.
type of Congress we have at the moment. And secondly is this idea of, unfortunately, that these forces are still very strong in not just Brasilia society in this case. The so-called market is very strong across the world, but is particularly strong and stupid, let's say, in Brazil. But I thought that we did something quite clever. We also have something which Britain doesn't have, which is a development bank, which is back in Lula's hand and is going to be used for promoting the Brazilian economy and the Brazilian sovereignty as well. And they managed to set up a seminar a day before the meeting of the Monetary Council when they were going to set up interest rates, and they brought in people like Stiglitz and various other economists to talk about how stupid it was that Brazil had an interest rate that was so high and how absolutely unnecessary that was. So I thought that was good, because at least, although they didn't manage to bring the central bank to bring interest rates down, it did bring discussion onto the media and onto public opinion, and it brought the idea that not everybody agrees that you have to have this very strict neoliberal austerity monetary policy. And Lula's been also talking a lot about that. So he's been complaining a lot about the attitude of the central bank. And I think that's good as well, because it means that people will then realize that that's nothing to do with Lula. He's not going to be the one blamed for that.
I mean, that's going to be
sense.
a challenge in itself, isn't it? Just continually speaking to the base and speaking to the people who voted for Lula and explaining why the challenges step by step as he goes through them. And I think one of the main areas where it seems the government will face a huge challenge is on the environment.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I know that Lula's brought in much better ministries, and I think they've also brought in laws trying to clamp down on the illegal logging and mining. And I saw that even in January, deforestation did come down, but of course it's a very difficult situation he's picked up from Bolsonaro, who was basically called free, open range on the Amazon, and in February and March it's picked back up. So what can you tell us about that struggle, and do you think Lula's in a good position with those new ministries to tackle illegal mining and deforestation head on?
I think the environment is going to be a hallmark of this government. But having said that, we do have some great challenges. Lula came in, the first thing he did was revoke mining in indigenous lands. He's also since then brought back an action plan for prevention and control of deforestation. He's been talking, as I think most people know, with countries about participating in the so-called Amazon Fund, which is also part of a fund that the Brazil itself has to address issues in the Amazon. And he's revived the CONAMA, which is the participatory council for the environment, that will bring in a number of specialists, social movements, etc., to participate in the policies of the environment. Having said that, the Ministry of the Environment has something like 45% of the staff it should have
After Bolsonaro's tenure.
to address the challenges.
Wow.
And it has no budget and won't have any budget this year to improve that. And what they're hoping to do is to be able to be interviewing people, etc., so that they will be able to come in for 24 when there is a little bit more budget. And also because these things take time to show up. The fact that in itself that you have more monitoring means that we're going to have more alert, and we're going to know a little bit more about what deforestation is going on. And on top of that, once you've deforested, then you have the fires. So it's quite likely that this is going to be a year of a very difficult year in terms of the environment for Lula, because all these actions and all the things that were being put in place will take time for it to take effect. So people are probably gonna go, what's going on? You know, then we put Lula there. Lula's meant to be dealing with the environment, and look at the numbers are going up. But hopefully it's going to go up and then eventually start to come down. But it's not going to be an easy year for Lula in that sense. Although we should have some very good people. And the environment is one of the things, not just the environment, the idea of green, low carbon economy is part of what our development bank is going to be funding, and is part of our new industrial strategy as well, because the Lula government has an industrial strategy that is not just looking towards the past, but also looking towards bringing in new technologies and new ways of looking forward. So I think this government is, if everything goes well, is going to focus a lot on climate change, on the environment, on things like sanitation, and on a green economy.
I mean, that's a cornerstone of a lot of radical policy agendas, isn't it? Greening the environment. So it's good to hear such a populous and an influential and important country for the future of the climate, but the battle against the climate crisis, sort of leading the way in that sense. I also think it's good, you know, you mentioned, but having those indigenous voices at the table, the voices of environmental defenders at the table, we can really take some positives from that, even if we don't see the results immediately. I'd just like to touch on one more key takeaway from Lula's government, and that is his importance on the international scale. And we saw Lula go to the US recently, and he was continually asked, are you going to provide weapons to Ukraine to fight Russia? And you know, he consistently showed he was a voice for peace. And what do you think what impact can Lula have, you know, as a voice for peace on the global stage, but also as a voice for international development, as a voice for fighting global inequality? You know, he's got a great track record on those things already.
Yeah, again, you know, the world now is not the same as when Lula came in. So I think he's got a far more difficult situation in terms of foreign affairs as he did. But yes, I think Lula's going to be a voice for peace. He's just about to fly to China now. And I'm sure that part of what he's going to be talking about is peace, because China's also been trying to be a dissenting voice in terms of addressing issues such as these wars that the war is going, the world is seeing, especially the Ukraine. But I'd like to leave it very clear that Lula is not a voice pro-Russia or pro anything else. Lula is a voice for peace. Lula doesn't believe that the way to address it. He's a man who was brought up. He's a union man, Lula. He was brought up and he became what he is by sitting on a negotiation table. And basically that's what he believes in. He believes that for you to achieve peace, we need to be sitting down and negotiating. He's not there saying, oh, you know, I'm going to be in the side of Putin and against the Americans, or I'm going to be pro this and against that. No, he's somebody who likes talking to everyone, listening to everyone, and try to build something. And for him, these things are important. So getting rid of hunger in the world, making a South-South alliance, bringing in peace, and the issue of the environment now is something very important. And how can you talk about the environment if you're sort of blowing up places everywhere, destroying everything, which means more things being built, plus all the, you know, environmental damage that war causes as well. So he's a voice for that. The other thing that he is a voice for is for the silent majority of countries, because to be honest, we hardly hear the voices of Africans or Latin Americans, or about what do they think of for example, the war in Ukraine. And for them, like for us in Brazil, a war is of no use to us. It just causes problems because we have relations with a number of countries, and when you have that, you end up having, for example, fertilizers are very important. They're very important for Africa as well. So Africa doesn't want to see, a lot of the countries in Africa don't want to see a sanction against Russia or this war in Ukraine going on. So Lula then stands up for a lot of these voices that are usually not heard about in the world. Also, he's got an eye, which for him is very important and for us is very important, towards Latin America. So he wants to rethink Latin American integration. And the way that he thinks about Latin America is, if our neighbors are doing well, then that's good for us. So he will be a voice for development in Latin America, for integration of Latin America, for working together in Latin America, and the same with Africa, you know. So these are important things. And finally, what I'd like to say is that when he went to Argentina, which was the first trip that he did as a president, and that was very symbolic as well, showing where his priorities are with our greatest, most important partner and neighbor. They sat down to discuss not a real currency as such, but a currency for the exchange of imports and exports between Argentina and Brazil without having to go through the dollar. And I think this is something, I know that this is something that he's going to be discussing with China as well. The possibility of having their trade relations outside the dollar system, which I think, personally, I think is an interesting and an important move for us not all to be so dependent on the dollar.
And it goes hand in hand with the increasing regional cooperation that he sort of embodies, and also goes hand in hand with the rise of other left-wing governments in Latin America, AMLO in Mexico and Gustavo Petro in Colombia. So really, really interesting time for the whole region. I think that's all we've got time for, Julia, but that's been a fantastic discussion, and I think some positive takeaways there for our audience, but also it sets in stone the challenges that Lula's government is going to be facing, and really shows why our solidarity continues to be important, even though we have Lula in government. Thank you.
It's all right. It's great, and I think we do need to to keep an eye on what's going on. And the challenges are all there. It's not just because Lula's in power that everything's going to be wonderful, but hopefully we will be making inroads. Just one last little thing, and it's just to say what a difference it makes since Lula's been in government. There has been about 900 people who were freed from slave labor. And it's not that slave labor didn't happen during Bolsonaro, it's that suddenly this has become a priority of the government, and it's obviously become a priority in the media as well. So people have been talking about this. So that's importance as well, a symbolic importance, let's say, of being in government.
Well, yeah, I even remember coup President Temer relaxing the definition of modern slavery, I think in 2017. So yeah, always amazing to see a direct positive impact. So thanks again for joining us, Julia, and
thank you.
Hopefully we'll catch up again soon.
Okay, nice to speak to you.